I'm going to turn this over to Hal and have at it. I think he's going to make us work today as well.
Thanks. Or not.
Or holler.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thank you to Kim for kindly extending a second invitation to speak to colleagues, and I want to name what strikes me as something remarkable about those of us in this business, which is that so many people are here when it's peak season, when we're trying to get those last gifts in, when people are leaving on vacation, when there's lots of stuff. So I'm honored to be back with my colleagues at AFP in Western North Carolina. Last time I spoke to AFP, I was in the beginning stages of transitioning from Chicago to the home we've had here in Fairview for a couple of years. Today I am happy to say that I am pretty much in the end stages of that transition, a little bit more frenzied. I want to turn this on by hitting B. Yeah. Okay. I'll hit it again.
Hit it again, let's see.
But there's like a funky thing up here, so. Thank you all very much for coming. There we go, perfect. So I'm in the now end stages of fully transitioning to Western North Carolina, and I couldn't be happier. Just in case you haven't noticed, there's a reason why many of us are here. The work I'm doing here now is through my nonprofit consultancy, Leadership For Impact, where my own focus is on executive coaching, crisis management, working with boards, and fundraising. And I'm hoping that we'll have the chance, beginning in 2019, to get to know each other better, as now I'll be a local colleague, and learn something about your work, and perhaps find opportunities for us to work together. I have some cards with me, and maybe afterwards we can spend a few minutes getting to know, or at least introducing ourselves. So thank you for being here. One of my all-time favorite tales as a longtime fundraiser myself is about the local homeless shelter in a city not so dissimilar from our own, seeking to expand both its programmatic and its capital facilities, mounting a major campaign, and the diligent development staff of the homeless shelter in question has done its job prospecting, going through all the lists, and identifies a well-known industrialist who's made a lot of money. Having done their research, they make an appointment to go visit with the gentleman in question to really talk about the merits of the new expanded dreams and visions of the shelter. The development staff is well prepared, not surprisingly, does an impassioned job of presenting to the industrialist, and sort of in the middle of their presentation, the guy says, you know, everybody thinks that just because I've worked hard and made some money, that they can come and talk to me about their favorite charitable needs. But nobody ever thinks about the fact that I have an elderly mother who requires the services of an institution And nobody ever thinks about the fact that my kid brother has mental disabilities that require full-time attention, and nobody ever thinks to mention my darling, sweet niece who requires round-the-clock attention. And let me tell you something. If I can manage to say no to all three of them, I surely have no problem turning you down. Today I want to discuss the ethics of contemporary fundraising. I'm a little nervous based on Kim's introduction because my intention is not to reaffirm the standard approach to fundraising ethics, but rather to raise some questions about the approach that we have traditionally taken in our field about our own code of ethics over the years. Usually when we talk about fundraising ethics, we immediately find ourselves in the realm of the preachy. I'm not a preachy sort of guy. I don't get a commission whether you follow all the ethics in our code of ethics or none of the ethics in our code of ethics. Instead, I want to raise for us the more serious question of what are we doing with our code of ethics? For it to resonate and be meaningful, our code of ethics as AFP professionals has got to, as I would suggest, do more than sit on a shelf in our office or be tucked away on our website. And so I want to raise some of those questions today by asking each of us as colleagues to do some of the heavy lifting in this regard. I want to begin with what I will call a working definition for a number of us today. It may not be your preferred definition, but at least for the time we're going to spend together, we'll use it as a way of sort of guiding our conversation. And so we begin with the question, what is an ethical dilemma? And there are any number of ways that we can approach this when we think about our own field, but I'm going to offer a pretty non-academic, not too highfalutin, straight-up definition of what we mean by an ethical dilemma. And you'll see, even so, this is not simple stuff. An ethical dilemma is a complex situation that often involves an apparent mental conflict between moral imperatives in which to obey one would result in transgressing the other. Now already, we're using language that is not simple. Complex situation, mental conflict, moral imperatives, obeying one results in transgressing the other. This reminds me of one of my favorite quotations from my favorite singer-songwriter, now deceased Leonard Cohen, who said, "The absence of the casual has long attracted me." What we're going to do today is anything but casual. This is heavy stuff. Maybe too heavy for the end of the year, but if we are going to be serious about the ethics of our field, then we are going to have to deal with things that are far from casual. Each of us as fundraisers is involved at one time or another in three basic value commitments, as I've tried to illustrate here in this slide. First, let's see if this, first is our commitment to the mission of our organization. The second is our commitment to the people we work with and the relationships we build with donors, users, clients, board members, and colleagues. And the third basic value that we as fundraisers bring to the table is our own personal value system and our own sense of personal integrity. Now, the point I want to make here is that as soon as any one of these conflicts with any one of the others, we have the makings of an ethical dilemma. When our personal values, say to transgender equity, conflicts with the political views of our major donors, we have the making of an ethical dilemma. When the best interests of our organization obligate us to solicit funds from corporate foundations who have at other times supported causes that we are uncomfortable with, we have the outlines of an ethical dilemma. Or, as was very popular a few years ago in a case involving the Smithsonian Institution, when a donor's desires conflict with the mission of our organization, we are in the realm of ethical dilemmas. Now, if we're lucky, many of us can get through a large chunk of our career without ever having encountered ethical dilemmas. But for most of us, this is the stuff of the work we do, particularly the longer we're in the business and the increased chance we have of climbing the organizational ladder. Now, I want to be clear. This is both obvious and often overlooked. No ethical dilemma exists when the choices are clear-cut. If you're staying up at night agonizing over whether to choose the obvious right path versus the obvious wrong path, then we need to have a separate conversation. Okay? The reality is an ethical dilemma as fundraisers ensue when choosing between two or more rights. Not a right versus a wrong. So to go back to the examples I mentioned earlier, it's right to please our donors. And it's right to enable inclusivity. And when those things conflict, we have an ethical dilemma. It's right to maximize the revenue for our organization. And it's right to avoid conflicts of interest. When those two things conflict, we have an ethical dilemma. When any one of these, our commitment to our organization's mission, our commitment to our donors, our commitment to our own sense of ethics and morality, when they conflict, we are in the realm of fundraising ethical challenges. To say it another way, only when we are forced to choose, not between good or bad, black or white, but between what we might call 50 shades of neither black nor white. One of our ethics is not violating copyright laws, so I wanted to make sure I reflected that. Only when we are in the realm of the gray are we dealing with fundraising dilemmas. And that's what makes this so hard. Think back about the headlines from our own Chronicle of Philanthropy or like-minded publications. Even in the years since you've been in the business, these are not about right versus wrong. Right? No self-respecting colleague of ours wakes up one day and says, I'm going to do the wrong thing. The challenge for us in our business is making peace with two rights that conflict with one another. Now, for the next several minutes, I'm going to turn this back to each of you in your own respective tables. I mentioned that there are some that may have never encountered a fundraising dilemma, a choice between two rights that conflict. But I suspect, given the diversity of this audience and the array of organizations we have served, that there are plenty of examples of a choice between right and right, which has challenged many of us in the workplace. So for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to ask you, just speaking at your tables, to talk about your fundraising dilemma in the context of these ethical challenges. Again, just to remind you, we're talking about what happens when the organizational mission may conflict with a donor's desire, or when a donor's desire may be in conflict with your own personal integrity, or any combination of these things. So let's spend a couple of minutes now encouraging you to share some of your own experiences. This works best when what happens at your table stays at your table. And I can't force that, but we can say as colleagues, we can pledge that to one another for our time. And by the way, if you're uncertain, or I don't ever want anybody to be on shaky grounds in this, make up an organization. Focus on the dilemma, and don't worry so much about the particulars if that's uncomfortable. Okay, it's to you. This is the group participation part for now.
$45 million capital campaign from the hospital. And the hospital was named with a man who was a senior executive for Philippines. And then the other was the more recent project was a new cancer center. And we had a lot of research. It was a research university hospital. And the chancellor told me that he wanted to go to New York and meet with the cigarette company headquarters and ask them for between $3 and $8 million. The researchers heard about it and went, were listening. And because he was as strong as he was, and because everybody was afraid of him, it really didn't fall to me to do anything other than to say, we're going, that's but it was a clear, it put a problem with the mission. Right. So, the fact that they all knew it. I guess happily the story ends with they looked at me and said, no, we don't give to anything that might call into question health care or something like that. To which I had my answer. I said, well, you just bought Beatrice Foods. So this gift could come from Beatrice Foods. At which point they laughed and said, no. But it was a very clear cut.
Here's one. At a institution of higher learning, this will be in Bay. Working with a relatively new supporter who was a very interesting person. Got a PhD in finance and was teaching at the start of the career. And one of the students said, well, if you know so much, why ain't you rich? So this person said, well, okay then. Quit teaching, opened a investment management company, and became a fabulous and was doing some part-time, still had a PhD, and made a nice gift to this institution of higher learning.
kind of want to
And
engage
the supporter told me, says, at the beginning of my career, I didn't know the intricacies of the laws. I knew finance, didn't know laws. And I made a mistake. And a government organization slapped my wrist, gave me a fine, and I learned my lesson, and that's a long time ago. Haven't done anything since then. He said, I wanted to let you know that. So I met with one of the departments that this supporter wanted to send the funds towards, and it was a size of case, high level, 5-figure gift, and there was much more behind that. And the chair and the faculty said, well, we don't want it because this is tainted money, because this supporter was slapped by this government organization 18 years ago. They got on the high horse. And so had faculty on one hand.
Okay, folks,
One
can I
thing
have
is
your
anyway
attention,
what this person was wanting to
please?
give, and this person just wanted to give to help students learn about the reality of business.
So one of the fundraising
So what we're gonna
dilemmas I seek to avoid in my life is making Kim angry. So I'm going to keep moving along, even though in each of these table assignments, I know we could spend a lot more time, and I'm going to want to unpack a little bit more than the next one. What I'd like you to do is sort of keep as wherever you got in your discussion, and we're going to sort of contextualize those conversations against some standard paradigms, if you will, of fundraising dilemmas. People who study these things, and I'm going to share with you some resources toward the end of the session for you to actually take back with you to work with your boards and your colleagues, so on and so forth. But people who study these things are fond of putting fundraising dilemmas in different kind of typologies or categories or paradigms. Probably the most famous comes from St. Mary's University of Minnesota, and some of you may have seen this. I'm a little worried when I was walking around that the guys at the back tables might not see this so clearly. By the way, with regard to any of these slides, if you see one you like, feel free to snap a picture. If you like one in particular, see me afterwards and I'll try to make available to you. I don't share the entire slide deck obviously for reasons of intellectual property, but I'm happy to share an individual one, or if you see one you like, wouldn't be this one, you could feel free to snap a photo at any time. But the St. Mary's University of Minnesota paradigm for fundraising dilemmas is interesting in view of the conversations that were just taking place at the tables. So in this case, there are so-called 7 ethical dilemmas in philanthropic fundraising. Now this is going to be a little bit different than the one that's at your table, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment. But I like this because it sort of raises a lot of questions for the work we do. And for some of you that have never faced this, it's probably a good education to say, whoa, I had no idea this is the stuff of which real conflict is made in our field. So I begin with the category referred to as tainted money. This is what happens when an organization's mission and the source of contributed funds find themselves in conflict. For example, an organization that fights for drug education in the school system would probably want to think twice about a major gift from the marijuana lobby. But these are real life things. The next category has to do with the long-held dilemma in the fundraising business, and I'm going to come back to this later, about compensation, in which our field has generally stood in opposition to paying finder's fees and against fundraisers working on commission. A third category of fundraising dilemma, which has become increasingly popular to discuss, in an era in which technology rules all of our lives has to do with privacy. This pertains, of course, to the conflicts that arise when an organization obtains and then retains highly personal information about donors that go beyond the particular needs of your individual organization at any point in time. An additional area of fundraising dilemma that is often cited by academics and others who study this has to do with issues referred to as stewardship. These are the tensions that arise between a donor's intentions and the needs of the organization. I referenced the case that many of you recall very popularly in DC when the Smithsonian Institution was given a $43 million gift only to have it rescinded when the donor became clear that what she wanted in terms of a museum exhibition violated the core principles of the museum itself. Another area of, how'd you like to be on that development team? Another core area of fundraising dilemma pertains to the issue of honesty and full disclosure. Probably this has never happened in your organizations, but there are times when 501c3 enterprises often sugarcoat or withhold information to donors about the cause or the details, the status of their organization in order to encourage a major gift. An additional area pertains, of course, to conflicts of interest that arise when nonprofit organizations do business with their donors or board members, including the ever-popular, never seems to go away completely phenomenon of fundraisers being called upon to act as executors for donors' estates. And an ethical dilemma number 7, which has to do, of course, with the appearance of impropriety. And remember I showed the Leonard Cohen quotation, "The absence of the casual has long intrigued me." This is the absence of the casual. The appearance of impropriety is when fundraisers engage in behavior that may not be technically illegal, but meet the unethical smell test, like accepting large gifts of gratitude from a donor, a trip to Europe, a visit to their vacation home, so on and so forth. Now this St. Mary's typology isn't the only way of viewing fundraising dilemmas. Our own Association of Fundraising Professionals, and each of you should have a copy of this, and I would ask you to get it now, has its own code of ethical standards, and their typology, which is similar to St. Mary's but just articulated differently, views ethical dilemmas in 4 categories: public trust, transparency, and conflicts of interest, solicitation and stewardship of philanthropic funds, treatment of confidential and proprietary information, and compensation, bonuses, and finder's fee. Now, if you I know we didn't get very far on it, but if you reflect on the table conversations and the 7 categories that St. Mary's University of Minnesota identifies, and our own AFP typology, you can see there's many different ways to categorize fundraising dilemmas and ethical conundra, but they all share some things in common. Now I'm going to ask us to do something few of us have likely ever done. And that is turn back in the tables to the table groups. Take a look at the AFP list. First, scan it yourself. And then I'm going to ask you to do something at your table that involves responding I'm right in your way, Alan. that involves responding to 4 separate questions. First, look at that list. What strikes you about it? Secondly, as you look at the list, go someplace where few of us have gone before, which is to ask the hard question, are these still relevant for an eleemosynary, for a fundraising context in 2019? Specifically, are there things on this list that purport to be a code of ethical standards that are missing? And perhaps even more heretical, ask yourselves the questions, are there things on this list that are no longer needed, that simply do not, I'll get it in a second. I told you not to call me. Are there things on this list that simply are no longer needed? Spend a little bit of time. It's going to be a combination of your individual scanning and then some tabletop conversations, please.
The very first thing that strikes me is that it was adopted in 1964 and amended in 2014. Is there any amendments between there? I didn't know that long.
I don't think they would put the additional amendments in there. I don't think they would designate on here.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's possible.
Because we're faster readers. Frame it in a more positive.
Right. I mean, I don't know, but like, you know, not.
The Bible, 8 and 10, you got 26, 25.
You know, your brain, that's one of the things that I'm really not here is fundraisers should move to 21. It's not yet, and funders follow.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the 18 that all content created by our is the property that our client. But
Like one thing, we wouldn't have them in here unless the situation arose that caused them
I was
to be
going
in
to say, we
here.
don't get any off.
So, don't tell people not to do something that somebody already knows.
I spent my whole career working with number 21, which is fine for me as a fundraising professional.
No.
But I still have trouble
But
with
then I don't.
a grant writer who has to work on a percentage and therefore can never take a brand new client. I mean, a young charity that can't really afford it. Can't take a flyer to say, if I succeed, then you get to use your percentage. And I've spent my career knowing that some grant writers never join AFB because of it. Or else they join and they just can't figure out a way to do anything about it.
I think what strikes me about all of this is how infrequently nonprofit organizations actually have this conversation and make it a part of their culture. I rarely see a nonprofit organization include this as part of their standard operating procedure or annual meeting or discussion with the board or with their staff. And you know, there's a lot of horrible examples on a national level right now of ethics that really tarnishes what we're trying to do as far as, at least in our industry, trying to keep an ethical profession.
Every few years, AFP will get out of the chair and start telling everyone to share this with donors. But I got to tell you, I've hardly ever found it hard to read all of Well, the donor bill of rights is the same.
I think I got an input of $10.
It's all very important.
I didn't even realize that.
Okay, let's take a quick check.
Weeks later.
Something that stands out to you as missing in 2019. Anything missing from this list? Just say it out loud.
Social media, the interactions with donors and everything, social media. Can you be friends with the donor on Facebook?
Okay, the whole question about social media and its impact on our code of ethics and the way we do business, the way we advertise our programs. What else is missing? Anybody?
Donor advised funds.
The whole question of DAF and the whole increasingly complicated thing. If you were going to rewrite or make an addition, what would it look like?
More like the 7.
More like,
The 7 you gave us.
okay, but no, I was asking specifically on DAF, if you were going to add something in, because you said it was missing, what would it look like? Donor advised funds.
Well, you would definitely have a letter of agreement or a memo.
The involvement of the board in, because this, as one of our members said here, could become one, not necessarily an issue of ethics, but certainly of governance. At what point do you allow a donor, no matter how well intentioned, to become the 800-pound gorilla in how your organization moves forward?
Yes, very, very well stated. Thank you. What are there things on this list that strike you as, to be polite, antiquated?
I'm still going to say number 21 and grant writers who can't join AFP because they like to work with small nonprofits, emerging nonprofits who can't pay their fee and who would prefer to occasionally allow a nonprofit to give them a percentage of what you bring in.
Okay, I'm going to return to the whole question of compensation and percentage in just a moment. Other things here that strike you as sort of so yesterday in terms of some of our younger colleagues, some of our younger board members, anything stand out? So I'm going to try in the little bit of time we have left, and by the way, I know some people have a hard finish at 1:30, and I respect that. Depends on the robustness of the conversation, but I'm going to ask us to contemplate the following reality. If this document, last revised in October of 2014, is to drive us in 2019 and beyond with a different kind of donor, a different kind of board member, a different kind of development staff, then my big appeal today is not that anything on here be eliminated or we add a few things. My big appeal is that we take this document as seriously as its authors intended us to do. That is, to engage with this document. So when I read this document, and others like it, here are some things that come to my mind. When circumstances change, what should happen to our ethical standards? The more baseline question there, of course, is, are ethical standards of fundraising immutable? Do they change? Can they change? Should they change? And for those of us who take our work seriously, such as the folks in this room, if they are not immutable, that is to say, if they aren't to change over time in response to different realities, by what process do we change our ethical code? And who makes these rules? Do you get to make them in your agency and you make them in yours? Is there a field? What is happening with regard to these issues? And here are some things that occurred to me. as a long-time development professional and now an executive coach working with the realities of boards, just some questions. When I look at this list, I am overwhelmed by the fact that we work in a world in which the impact of #MeToo and the culture of fundraising has perhaps not caught up, or this has perhaps not caught up to that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to introduce you. I want to introduce you to something that is coming out of our own organization, the Association of Fundraising Professionals. This is too small to see, so I'll make it clear. Earlier this year, in 2018, AFP published the document, Sexual Harassment in the Fundraising Profession. There, the results of AFP's own analysis, coupled with the Chronicle of Philanthropy, note that 25% of women fundraisers report having experienced sexual harassment in the fundraising field.
We find that number low.
As did the Chronicle of Philanthropy, who quoted a British survey that thought the number was closer to 40%. Okay? No surprise here. Not typically a one-time occurrence, largely perpetrated by men, and often taking the form of inappropriate sexual comments or unwanted touching or physical contact. If our code of ethics is to be serious, we should be thinking about how we are training our development departments, our board members, our philanthropists, our donors, who are often at the core of the issue as we move forward. But this, I would suggest, perhaps the most obvious in 2019, missing from our existing list, is only one of them. I'd like to suggest, I don't care how you answer the question, but what happens when ethical standards today conflict with our job to raise the most amount of money for our cause? We know what our traditional responses have been, but for example, this is the change in the philanthropic world even since this document was revised. Corporate sponsorships, the rise of foundations, GoFundMe pages, the impact of social media, the rise of the innovation sector, social entrepreneurship, and corporate social responsibility in for-profit agencies that are having an impact on our work. This is not the same field that it was when you started. Our ethical code may be in need of some analysis. Not because what's here is bad, but because if we're serious about being the bastions of morality and ethics, then we can't let this sit as a page on our website. We can't just wave it every now and again. Right? We need to be engaging with this. Now, at the risk of being completely heretical, I'd like to cite another one of my favorite quotations from Bertrand Russell. In all affairs, it's a healthy thing now and then to hang a question mark on the things you have long taken for granted. My esteemed colleagues, I believe, though I doubt Bertrand Russell wrote this for fundraisers, I believe this speaks to us. It is time for us to consider hanging a question mark on things we have long taken for granted. So hate me if you will, but I raise a few questions. Are we still certain that percentage-based compensation is unethical? As philanthropy gets more complicated, is there really something wrong with linking the compensation of our development professionals to enhanced performance? Could it be that now is the time to rethink this long-held notion that those who do the social good should somehow have to arbitrarily cap their earnings and therefore not allow us to attract the most talented people for the biggest challenges our causes face? Now, you could say no. It's perfectly better the way it is. That's fine. This is not about the answer. What I'm asking us to contemplate is, are we willing to ask the questions surrounding long-held beliefs? There's another one. Are naming rights in perpetuity the ethically right thing to do? I know we made promises to our donors today for major seven-figure gifts, to name stadia, to name theaters, to name programs. And in the blink of an eye, our business has changed. Our field has changed. That in perpetuity gift now is no longer meeting the needs of our own organizations. And one more. Is it possibly time to rethink our attitude toward overhead? We know. We know that thankfully, even the self-appointed guardians of regulation in our field, Charity Navigator and GuideStar, have begun to do this. Since the publication of his highly controversial but must-read book, Uncharitable, which if you don't know this, you've got to get this for Christmas, Dan Pallotta insisted that everybody in the fundraising business, everybody, from programmers to social workers to educators to lawyers, everybody in the fundraising business start wearing t-shirts that said, "I am overhead." Because we're the ones delivering the goods in the trenches, and yet we are still holding dear to a set of ethical principles that may no longer resonate. So look, it interests me less how we answer those questions, except for this one. What are we supposed to do with our ethics? We can write them, we can draft them, we can appoint a subcommittee and relook at them. But if we don't engage with them, if we're not engaging with our board, with our staff, with our donors, then we're missing the opportunity to take our ethics seriously. So just to conclude, I want to cite two resources that may be helpful for you in the work of your own agencies. One comes from our own Association of Fundraising Professionals. In September 2018, they published, it's on the website, it's a beautiful volume of sample cases for ethical education. And slightly a little older than this is Marilyn Fisher's book, Ethical Decision Making in Fundraising. If we are going to take our ethics seriously, then we have to engage with them and not consider them carved in stone, unworthy of constant monitoring and evaluation. I'm over time. I'm happy to hang out and meet and talk about some of this. If I can be helpful along the way, please reach out and be in touch. Thank you all very much. Have great holidays. Happy New Year.
So Hal, you do not disappoint. Thank you.
3 minutes over.
I think Autumn at the back table just said we need to send this to our folks at our international office, just to light a fire, engage in the conversation. So thank you for that. Happy holidays, everybody. Have safe, wonderful time. Good luck next week, closing gifts, and we'll see you in January.